Hello, so my name is Rebecca Crane. I lead the Centre for Mindfulness Research and Practice at Bangor University. And I'm going to speak today about our work within Bangor University on assessing the quality of teaching of mindfulness-based programs and the adherence to the program, which, as I will unpack, is a really important factor in ensuring the quality of the developments going forward. So in this talk, I want to unpack why we began to address these issues, what were the challenges that we were trying to solve, why and where the question of competence matters, and then I want to introduce the tool which we called the Mindfulness-Based Interventions Teaching Assessment Criteria, how we developed it, the research on it, and how it's structured. And then I'll unpack the results of the research. So in a very broad way, since we began our work at the Centre for Mindfulness Research and Practice in 2001, we were constantly bumping into these sorts of challenges of how this was very new, it's a very emergent field. The evidence was just beginning to show very strong promise, but there was no structures for professionals working within the field. And we were beginning to train and doing that in the context where people were going out from our training programs into a context where there was no standards, there was no issues around how to ensure the integrity of the work going forward. And within our own training program, we didn't have systems for knowing and being able to actually define when somebody is meeting the required skills. So these were complex challenges. And you could divide these areas up into three very interlinked themes. One is around teacher formation, so the actual way that we were training people. The other is around good practice standards and ethics. And this was actually work that we did in collaboration with other centres across the UK and internationally, to look at building consensus on good practice. And then there's the top circle, which is around teaching competence and integrity. And the talk that I'm offering now is really around that top circle, but of course it links with these other themes. So we developed the MBI TAC because we were delivering training for people to become mindfulness-based program teachers within the context of a master's program. And within that context, we needed to ensure that we were assessing both the skills, but also the knowledge and theory that our students were developing on that training program. We had well-established methods for assessing theory building through all the conventional academic processes, but we didn't have established processes for assessing the teaching skills of our trainees. Beyond our own training program, our program started in 2003, but Oxford and Exeter universities started master's programs around 2006-07, and we were keen as a field to ensure that graduation from one master's program would have equivalence to graduation from another. So we needed to establish benchmark standards. And in the research context, it's very important that the variable of teacher quality and program adherence is assessed so that one knows that one can interpret research results in ways that rule out that it might be because the teacher wasn't as skilled that the results weren't as promising. So I led some preliminary work mapping out the models we were using for training and exploring how to think about competence in the context of this particular field. And in order to do that, I drew on work that was happening around competence assessment in related fields. So I looked at the literature in the educational field, in the psychotherapy field, in the CBT field, to really look at how these fields were thinking about skill building and how to assess skill building. So that was kind of the baseline work that we did before beginning to think about actually developing a tool. In the wider literature on intervention integrity or fidelity, and the two words are used interchangeably, there's three elements that one needs to consider. So firstly, adherence. So when this is a relatively straightforward concept that relates to the level to which the therapist or teacher is delivering the core ingredients of the program. So in the context of mindfulness-based programs, in week 1, there's always a body scan. And the question is, well, was that delivered? Yes, no. So quite straightforward. Differentiation is similar, but almost the reversal of that. So this is a check that elements were not being included that weren't part of the protocol of that particular intervention. And then the third element, competence, is much more complex. So this is the level of skill with which the teacher or therapist is actually enacting the delivery of the program. And our aim was to develop a tool that would address all of these three areas within one tool. But we were from the outset very clear that there was some key challenges in the context of the work that we do in mindfulness, where there's a very strong emphasis placed on the inner work that the teacher is doing and how that inner work gets translated into practice in the teaching space. So there's the hypothesis is that it's as much how the teacher embodies the practice of mindfulness and communicates through their way of being, as that's as important, if not more important, than actually the content of what they're delivering. So what we wanted was a tool that would really capture these more subtle, nuanced aspects of what it is to be a mindfulness-based teacher. And we were aware of some risks. So what we didn't want was to actually propel teachers into a sense of doing competence. By that, I mean actually triggering them out of the mode that we really invite in mindfulness teaching of being present in the moment, being connected to your inner experience, allowing the moment by moment emergence of experience, not being identified with me or mine. So by contrast, if one was trying to be a good teacher, you would have a sense of striving towards an ideal of performing a role, of ticking certain boxes. There would be a sense of my competence, and which would have the effect of separating the teacher from the participants in the space. So this was the sort of shadow side of what we were doing that we really wanted to avoid touching into through the work. So by contrast, we really wanted to develop a framework that embraced the subtleties of the teaching process. So the importance that a teacher does have expertise, but actually that they embody a sense of not knowing and a sense of willingness to allow experience to unfold. A sense of actually, really being attentive to agenda and curriculum and adhering to curriculum, but also having this sense that actually in this moment there is no agenda at all. So these really paradoxical tensions that a skilled mindfulness teacher creatively inhabits. And also we were really wanting to embrace the theme of humanness within the tool. So in many ways, what we're exploring in a mindfulness-based course is how to be more fully human and be at ease with who you are. And that really requires us to turn toward our own imperfection, our own vulnerabilities, our own confusions, shame, doubt. All of that needs to have space within our experience. So the striving towards competency would certainly reduce the space for those more kind of delicate areas of what it is to be human. So almost this strange paradox that we wanted a competency framework that would embrace the potential to be incompetent, but to hold that in a certain way. So as we set out on this work, we were very clear that we cannot know what's happening within a teacher. So we wanted an observational tool that could draw on what we see. So the behavior of the teacher, their nonverbal communication, their kind of way of being, the way they hold their body. We also wanted to draw on what is heard, and what as the assessor, what we also experience, what we feel. So how the process of the teaching is touching us, and that's the delicate piece as an assessor of actually recognizing when we've moved into interpretation, but at the same time we do need to use the immediacy of our experience to support making judgments about assessment, about competence level. So we were very keen that we would not be assessing teachers from a cool, distant observational perspective, but from the perspective of direct experiential participation in the teaching, as if we were in the room. And we were also clear that the assessor has to be an experienced mindfulness-based teacher in the particular program that's being assessed, and that however experienced they are, if they're not experienced with these criteria, they won't know how to benchmark in ways that are consistent with how the tool is being used. So one needs to train to use the tool to come to a level of reliability. So we stepped forward into a series of developmental stages. So I led this process, and I was collaborating with colleagues at Exeter University and Oxford University. And we basically iterated a number of versions of the MBI TAC and tested the tool out in practice. And then at a certain point, we pressed the pause button. This was around 2010, and we researched that version. The way that the tool is structured is that there are certain domains within the teaching process. So we actually started out with multiple domains, I think more than 20 different aspects, different elements, different areas within the teaching process. But gradually, as we move through iterations of the MBI TAG, we narrowed that down to 6 areas that I'll speak about in a moment. So you could see that those, almost in terms of the structure of the MBI TAG, those are kind of like the vertical threads on a piece of cloth. And then running, interweaving with those in the other direction are the levels of competence, which again, I'll unpack in a moment. So in each domain, a trainee could get assessed at a certain level of competence, that could vary across the different domains. So the domains of competence. So the first one is at the top there, the top circle is very much based around the curriculum issues. So is the teacher covering the curriculum, but also are they doing that in a way that's flexible and responsive to the needs in the room? Are they organized? The second one, relational skills, is the teacher connecting with participants in ways that really embody the spirit of this approach. Guiding mindfulness practices, are they following the form for guiding practices? Are they bringing in all the elements that need to be considered? Are they communicating the key learning that's needed for each of the meditation practices? Embodiment of mindfulness. So how is the teacher actually communicating mindfulness through their way of being in the space? How the sort of sense that the inner work of the practice of the teacher actually is kind of becoming tangible to participants in the space. They're going away with a taste of what it's like to be mindful. The fifth one, conveying course themes through interactive inquiry and didactic teaching. So mindfulness-based teaching is a very interactive way of offering learning. So whenever the teacher isn't guiding a practice, they're in some way in some sort of interactive process with the trainees and with the participants in the space. So this domain assesses how effective they are in communicating the core teaching themes through their interactive way of teaching. When they're doing didactic teaching, is that linked with the experience of participants? Is it being communicated in a way that's live and connected? And the final one, holding the group learning environment. So how is the teacher drawing from the individual experience of participants and supporting the group to get a sense of the whole themes that are being explored in a mindfulness course? How is the teacher creating a context of safety, but also a space within which the participants can explore and be challenged? So these are the 6 domains. So these interact. So just before I go on about it, so within each domain in the MBI TAC tool, there's texts that unpack that domain, describe it, and divide it into a number of key features. So this is an example of the relational domain. And you'll see that there's 5 key features within this domain, as there is in most of the others. And with it, there's criteria for how you assess each of these key features across each domain. So we hold all the domains equally in an assessment process. We don't know empirically whether some are more critical than others in supporting participants' learning. We know that some are more multifaceted and multidimensional. And we also know that several domains are represented in any one moment. So when a teacher is engaged in interactive dialogue with the group, they're also holding the group process, they're attending to the curriculum that needs to be covered, they're holding the group space, they've got relational connection with participants and so on. So there's complex interaction between these domains. But at the same time, they're distinct enough to what we discovered in the psychometric research was that each domain was distinct enough to hold its own, as it were, as a concept. So in terms of the competence, levels of competence, we drew on work led by Dreyfus and Dreyfus in the 1980s. This was the era when computers were on the ascendancy, and there was a societal conversation about the potential for computers to take over human capacities. And of course, that's very much on the agenda now. At that time, there was this real sense that actually humans would always have the capacity for intuition, which computers couldn't have. And so they'd identified a number of themes that crossed over a range of different complex skills. So they looked at grandmaster chess players, maestro violinists, airline pilots. So a range of different skills that required years of learning and engagement. What they discovered was that there was commonalities across these. So they were all lifelong endeavors with subtle shifts occurring throughout the development of that person. And key to that development of skill was the increasing role of intuition in the process. So just to unpack that a little bit further, the layers of competence that we used within the MBI TAC drew on this Dreyfus and Dreyfus model. And one can see that at advanced beginner, for example, you're very much following rules. There's a sort of structure, and you can imagine when you're learning to drive a car, there's a real sense of needing to apply a lot of attentional effort to really think about all the elements of gear change, brake, feet. So you're really applying rules. And what's happening as you're moving towards competency and then towards proficiency and then towards really integrating those skills at advanced level is that you're being able to let go of that attentional energy. And as you let go of that, you're able to it becomes more of a body memory. and you can apply the skill intuitively. So you don't have to sort of decompose all the elements into their component features. You've got a sort of fluid, flexible sense of the whole. So the work of Dreyfus and Dreyfus was translated into the clinical psychology context by Sharpless and Barber, and we then took it and translated it into the mindfulness teaching context. So just in summary, when one's making an assessment of competence, you could imagine that these is like concentric circles sort of moving out. You start close in with the very immediacy of observation of what's happening in the teaching space and the experiential feel of that, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're sensing as an assessor. You then take into account your response to that, any emotions that arise in connection with teaching observations. But this is also where there needs to be a lot of skill, because one doesn't want to run away with your reactions and responses. You need to hold those as data and recognize that my opinion about the teaching is not necessarily the last word. So we're wanting to keep this open perspective. And you're using a skillful response from the data, from that close in, and from your response to the teaching to form a view, and using the criteria within the MBI TAC related to the domains and the competence levels to build that. And what we know is that this is a skill, so it takes assessors some time to build that skill. So turning to the research, so we were very keen to discover whether it was indeed possible for teachers to view the teaching of others and come to the same conclusion. So is it a reliable and valid tool for assessing the teaching competence and adherence of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy teachers, mindfulness-based stress reduction teachers? So this was our primary research question. And I led research collaborating with Oxford and Exeter universities that was embedded within routine practice within the master's programs there, where all of these programs were requiring students to demonstrate their teaching skill, teaching elements of the program, teaching the whole program and having elements of those assessed. And we had two assessors, two markers, rate the teaching independently, and we then looked at how close and how far away they were from each other in the judgments that they came to. So the results were basically very encouraging. So we discovered that there was strong internal consistency, which demonstrates that the domains are aspects of an overall construct of competence. So each domain, it was representing an element of an overall whole. And the inter-rater reliability was strong. So for example, we had, when you looked at absolute agreement, i.e. those two independent assessors landed on exactly the same assessment point 60% of the time. And 97% of the time they were on adjacent assessment points. We noted that the embodiment domain was the domain that had the least agreement, and we were curious about that, and there was quite a bit of learning for us in that. In terms of validity, at this very early stage, it's quite hard to establish validity. But what we did was just test out the face validity with colleagues in the UK to see whether, as a sense check, this made sense to them, the descriptors that we landed at, whether it chimed with their experience of the teaching process. And we were getting very encouraging feedback in that regard. We also were interested to discover whether teachers who are assessed at a certain stage in their learning journey and then reassessed later, a year or 2 years later, whether their competence had climbed, which you would expect it to do if they had input. And we discovered that indeed was the case, which again was encouraging. But the holy grail in all of this is the question of predictive validity. And this is in a way one of the sort of, from a research perspective, why one would go down this road. So does the MBI TAC predict outcomes and mechanisms of action, i.e. one might hypothesize that a more skilled teacher would get stronger outcomes. So that research is still very much ongoing, and I'll unpack that a little bit shortly. So in summary, the results of that very preliminary psychometric research on the MBI TAC were promising. We discovered that experienced teachers who are trained in the use of the tool can closely agree to pretty good levels of reliability and validity. Since then, we've engaged in various other investigations related to the MBI TAC, and it's very preliminary. So all of this is really early steps in exploring the use of the tool, the applications of the tool, the limits of the tool. For example, the one on the bottom left there, the teacher competence in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression, that was an attempt to examine the use of the MBI TAC in an existing randomized controlled trial with a range of teachers who did have varying levels of experience. So the teachers were all rated using the MBI TAC. And on the measures that were actually embedded within that RCT, we couldn't discern difference between or very little. There was some small markers, but broadly speaking, the MBI TAC was not discriminating in terms of higher competence means better outcomes. So we're very much still exploring that area. So, but from a practice perspective, the MBI TAC is being really taken up in practice internationally, and it's being used in a range of different ways. So it's being used as a reflective tool, and this in a way wasn't what we expected. So, but it's very much being rolled out to trainees on the ground, their supervisors, and they're using it as a tool to support reflective conversation. And to that end, my colleague Gemma Griffiths at the Centre for Mindfulness in Bangor has led the development of an adapted version of the tool, which will be published later this year in 2021, called the Teaching and Learning Companion, the TLC, which is actually tailor-made to support reflection, but uses the same domains. People are using it in the process of giving and receiving supervision, developing trainer skills, because it really, in a way, the MBI TAC is like a framework of the territory of skills that are being developed. So it's really helps trainers to get clearer, what are we targeting here? And the tool is also being used to assess teacher level in research trials and in training programs. The take-up of the tool has been pretty strong, so it's used across all of the UK and the Dublin Masters Programme. It's used in multiple centres internationally, both informally as a reflective tool and as an assessment tool. It's embedded within the international MBCT pathway. It's used as part of the government-funded training for MBCT teachers in the NHS, and there's been multiple translations of the tool and multiple adaptations of the tool. And all of those translations and adaptations are freely available on the MBI TAC website, which I'll give you the link for at the end. If you want to train to use the tool, we have a sort of 3-layer process. So there's an initial level, which is we teach as a 5-session online delivery, using clips of teaching of different teachers with different levels of competence. And we show those clips and then reflect on them using the MBI TAC as a lens. It's a really rich and learning-filled process. And at this level, we're really building familiarity in the tool and its structure and the process of using it, and really inviting participants to take it away and use it informally to support their own development, or if they're working with supervisees or trainees, to begin to informally introduce it into those contexts. The level 2 training takes that deeper. So in this training, we're aiming to enable the trainees to be able to assess using the tool reliably. So we're iteratively ensuring that domain by domain, there's a sort of level of precision and accuracy in using the tool. We also want to support people to use the tool in supervision and training, and within those contexts to use the framework of the tool to give skillful feedback that is encouraging but also precise and clear about the areas of strength and the areas of learning needs. And then the level 3 training is really a test of reliability. So it's actually people who want to ensure that they are using the tool to a benchmark level can actually receive some clips of teaching that have been benchmark assessed, and they can then independently assess those and see how close or far away their assessment points are lining up. So those are the main things I wanted to communicate today. Thank you for listening. So you can go to the mbitac.bangor.ac.uk website, and there the tool, both the full version of the tool, summary version of the tool, and various short versions that can be used in supervision, for example. There's lots of resources there, guidance on how to use the tool to give feedback, more detail about the training, and then the translations of the tool, and the various adaptations of the tool for the school context, for workplace context, for teaching mindfulness courses online, etc. So wishing you well, and thank you for listening.